can you draw a line, do you think, between the shift that's taking place on a topic like Israel, where today's conversation is very different to how it was in the 60s, and with the broader kind of racial discussion and how some of the kind of leaders in the African American progressive community have very different ideas now to their equivalents back then? It seems like it's a different form of progressivism today.
I would say actually for the most part, if I were to guess, most African Americans have zero opinion on Israel. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a topic that actually comes up in the communities, right? Because there's no single African American community. There's multiple communities. In terms of progressive politics, I'd say the 50s, 60s represented a very specific kind of way of thinking, which was informed by a kind of spirituality and a very cosmic outlook. And that is not to say necessarily that the kind of spirituality that informed people's ways of thinking was institutional. A lot of people in the 50s and 60s actually revolted against traditional institutions of religiosity, but they still heavily explored things like Hinduism and Buddhism and religions of the Far East and religion in general. But that move actually started to collapse into the 70s and the 80s. And people who entered academia in particular, who were progressives, did not have that in general, and I'm generalizing here, did not have that sort of spiritual cosmic perspective of human beings. And a lot of things became political in the sense that prior to the 70s, there was always this worldview, I think to some extent, even within politics, that there's the political realm, there's the public realm, but then there's also the private realm. And there's also a cosmic realm, right, which is separate from the political realm. Not everything is political. But that has shifted today and has been shifting for a long time. But everything is now subsumed into the political. Everything from the personal is political. And I think that has affected the kind of rhetoric we use to talk about various different conflicts today, which again, to reiterate, end up dehumanizing people, reducing them to stereotypes, reducing them to caricatures, projecting the American experience and American history, for example, on other countries and other nations' histories. So I think it is, at least in part, a product of the shift from the 60s to the 70s, and that spiritual sensibility that it seems no longer exists, or certainly has been desiccated to a certain extent.
So that's interesting. So in a sense, then, it's not specifically Christian thinking, but spiritual or more cosmic thinking, as you put it. The fact that that has been reduced, what is the effect? It makes people less bonded to other human beings in some way, or it allows a more divisive political way of thinking to take over the whole conversation, so that there's less of a sense of what we have in common. Do you think that's what's happened?
Well, I think actually people have less of a sense of themselves, of the fullness of themselves, when everything is political, when every single issue on earth that affects our society can be reduced to politics. There's no inner life of the human being anymore. There's no contemplation of the inner world or the inner life or the inner psyche of the human being. Everything is political. And I think that's a huge problem that can result, I think, in a lot of narcissistic ways of being. And narcissism is not, as many believe, selfishness. Narcissism actually is an absence of the self, for which one overcompensates by seeking out approval from people, and out of which one becomes actually addicted to approval from other people. And of course, I think a lot of our social media platforms certainly don't de-incentivize these narcissistic traits. So when you have a situation in society where people are not really tapped into a sense of their inner being, and have no sense of a life that is separate from the public realm or from the social realm, I think that can result in a collapse of a sense of holisticness, which can then in turn lead to narcissistic traits, which can lead to the sort of echo chambers that you see developing on social media. Because again, when you have no sense of self, you feed off of other people's approval, which incentivizes the creation of these echo chambers. If you and certain members of another community share a certain political belief, it also reinforces our bipolar political system, in which instead of one party holding its own party accountable, it dedicates most of its time and efforts to attacking the other party. And as a result, both parties become weaker. So I think all of these aspects are actually affected by a loss of spirituality, at least in part. And I'm not saying that, I don't want to be reductive. I'm not saying a loss of spirituality is responsible for everything, but I do think it affects the way we see ourselves and the way we choose to be in relationship with others.
So clearly what you've said can be applied both on the right and the left. No doubt there are echo chambers in all corners, but it does seem particularly reminiscent, perhaps, of the kind of progressive corner where some of what we've seen in recent year and a half, does seem almost religious. We had John McWhorter on the show last week, and he's pretty clear about that he thinks some of these ideas are pretty much a new religion. Do you take that view?
I can understand the idea that, out of a spiritual vacuum, people will grasp to different dogmas. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's a religion. I would characterize what's happening certainly as dogmatic, and a certain kind of orthodoxy that I ultimately think is going to lead to canceling itself out, because I think in many ways it's unsustainable. But I wouldn't go so far as to call it a religion. I think it's a little bit more narrower than that, which isn't to say, obviously, religion has its dogmas, but religion also tends to have something more than dogma, right? Whereas a lot of the cultural trends that I'm seeing right now tend to be, in my opinion, purely dogmatic, as opposed to offering something outside of dogma.
So it's basically got the bad aspects of a religion without the good bits.
There's no redemptive quality because there is no sense of the human being outside of the political, right? There is no sense of the human being as separate from the political or social realm within the particular thought processes of some on the left today.
A couple of specific examples. In the area that is known as critical race theory, the concept of whiteness, the concept of white supremacy, the concept that white people carry within them some sort of sin of a kind that they may not be conscious of, but is somehow deeply within their being and they need to constantly strive to overcome. That sounds quite a lot like original sin. It sounds quite kind of Christian adjacent in its roots. Do you see that connection?
No, because the concept of original sin says that everyone has original sin. It has nothing to do with your skin color. The concept of original sin says that by virtue of being human, you have original sin. And also that, of course, you are redeemable. Both of those elements are missing in the sort of whiteness theology, if you want to put it that way.